Today we're going to be looking at how a high stakes poker player thinks about the game. I'm going to be giving you guys a free lesson, and it's based around this month's module over in the Upswing Poker Lab. If you want to see my new module with 20 hands, you can check that out in the description below. But today, for free, I'm going to walk you guys through how I think about hands, and basically we're going to talk about poker at a high level, but without a lot of the simulation, technical, super nerdy side of stuff. Basically, we have a lot of that kind of information in the lab where people really know their ranges down pat. And that's not really how I play in these live full ring games because, frankly, I just don't have the time to study like that. So I'm going to talk about how I approach spots and how I think about poker, which should make you able to win even in some pretty high stakes games without the super technical fundamental analysis type of background that really you should have if you're going to play professionally, but maybe you don't have the time to. So on that note, we're going to jump in here and we're going to be talking about all of the decisions that I make in this hand as well as how to approach some of these spots. So to start off with, we are playing in a super high stakes game. It is something like 200, 400 with the 800 getting on a decent amount of the time. But in this one, we're looking at 200, 400 with a $400 ante. We open up pocket kings on about a $500,000 stack. And Terrace calls on the button with pocket sevens. So before we actually talk about this flop, I think that pocket sevens here for Terrace pre-flop. This is kind of just the way that I approach this. Again, we're coming from a strategy where we do not know it's 13% here and 72% there. Just kind of broadly speaking, the way we're approaching it. On the button, facing an open this deep, we're going to want to play a lot of hands in Terrace's shoes. And as you get deeper, it's important to have most of your hands in both the call and the 3-bet range. Because of that, in Terrace's spot, if I had sevens, I would be doing a chunk of calling, a chunk of 3-betting. I think this hand doesn't mind either way, so maybe I'm 3-betting about half the time or so. I try to make it pretty easy numbers, either 1 out of 4 times, 1 out of 2 times, or 3 out of 4 times, and I randomize using the chips. So basically, I look at a chip and see what direction that it's at. Anyway, pocket sevens, this deep, I'm going to do a bit of both, so I obviously am fine with Terrace's call, and Josh decides to call in the big blind with queen 3 of clubs. We take a flop. It's 10, 8, 4, 2 spades. Action checks to me with kings. This is kind of an interesting spot. So typically speaking, if it's a heads up pot versus the big blind, you're going to be doing quite a lot of c-betting on this board. But three-way with a player in position very deep, you're actually going to have a lot of checking. Now, I don't mind if we want to execute a strategy with low frequency c-bet, or if we want to check our whole range to the button if we think he's going to stab quite often. But my piece of advice as you get into some super deep stack poker would be that you want to try and keep your range together so that you know you're going to have a lot of strong hands. Typically speaking, on boards that do not super favor the preflop raiser, I'd probably do a lot of checking or possibly even check my entire range. On a board like, let's just say 10, 8, 7, I would definitely be looking to check all of my hands. Here, I don't mind the idea of a small amount of bets or checking the whole range. I think that they're both fine. Now, mathematically, I'm sure that a small frequency of bets probably does better. But as you get deeper, we want to make sure that we're going to have the strong hands in our range. So with kings, we decide to check here over to Terrace, who now has an interesting decision to make with his pocket sevens. How do sevens want to play on this board when checked to? Well, typically speaking, when the button bets in these spots, the button will bet most of their stronger hands that want to continue and check back pretty weak. The reason is pretty simple. On a three-way flop, you want to make sure that you can charge the hands that are behind you when you do have a good hand. And when you check back, you don't have to defend yourself all too often because both players have to defend versus each other. So in this situation, if I'm Terrace, I'm probably leaning towards mainly checking here with my pocket sevens, but I don't mind mixing in a bet every now and then, maybe knock out some hands that do have some equity and get a little bit of thin value against a few holdings that are possibly able to check call. But generally speaking, I don't love betting this hand. A few reasons. First off, when you have under pairs, the lower the under pair is, the more you like to bet. So for example, on 10, 8, 4 here, typically speaking, sevens likes to bet less than fives because sevens is a little bit less vulnerable. Also, when I have the spade here, I don't really like getting check raised quite as often because if I bet this hand and get check raised, I'm probably just going to be bet folding. So I'd rather not have that equity in my hand. I'd rather maybe bet some sevens like red sevens where I'm more fine folding to check raise. Either way, Terrace does decide to go ahead and bet 1/3 pot. Not necessarily a bad play, but probably not the one I would lean towards making. Josh gets out of the way, back over to me with pocket kings here. So A couple things to think about. To start off with, this is a very small bet. It's about 30-ish% pot, maybe even a little bit less than that. So we're going to want to be check raising this quite frequently. Generally speaking, as bets get smaller, you should be raising more often. And as bets get bigger, you should raise a lot less. Let me just say hypothetically, Terrace bet full pot here. I would put my entire continue range into just check calling because my opponent is very polarized, and when they're polarized, it's less necessary for you to have raises. Again, when you play deep stack poker, it's important that you can have a lot of different hands in your range, and it's also important that you protect your calls versus large bets. So with that in mind, maybe even versus some of the larger bet sizes, I'm sure a hand like pocket fours or 10-8 suited might still like check raising some of the time, but I would rather protect my check call range and lose that little bit of value by trying to simplify my life. Anyway, with kings here facing a bet this small, I do think check raise is pretty much the standard play. We do want to occasionally have some check calls on boards like this. Aces and kings certainly do fit the bill. If I checked queens or jacks, I'd pretty much always be check raising because those hands are more vulnerable. I don't really want to see the turn as often and let a hand like king queen or ace queen or something like that improve the top pair if I have, for example, pocket jacks. Whereas when I have aces or kings, I'm way more okay with that threat, particularly aces. A good rule of thumb, if you want to have some check call traps, aces when you have the suit on the flop is a kind of nice way of doing it. There are really not too many turns you could be that concerned about. And that hand is going to be able to play nicely in both the check call down line or the check call check line. It's basically a very nice hand to trap if you want to make sure you are trapping in these spots, and you should. If we don't check call some of our high pairs, Terrace can overbet this turn, and my range is going to have some issues facing that. Anyway, overpairs should mainly check raise, and in these situations, I don't mind 3.5x to 4.5x type sizes. Typically speaking, 3.5x is my kind of go-to. Terrace did bet a little smaller than normal here, so I ended up going 4,500, a little bit larger than my normal, but totally fine. We've talked about our value range here as far as overpairs go. As far as our sets go, certainly hands like pocket fours are going to almost always be check raising, or basically always going to be check raising. Pocket eights, I probably just about always check raise. Maybe pocket eights with a spade, I mix in a check call every now and then. And then pocket tens, I'm going to do a bit of both. As the bet size in position gets larger, I would do a bit more check calling. So in this spot facing such a small bet, I'd probably do 1 out of 4 times or 1 out of 2 times check raise and the rest check call. By check calling our top sets, it does give us more opportunity to check call in later streets. But as we get deeper, check raising top set does get a lot better because you set up yourself to be able to win a lot of money. And, when you're this deep, when you have, 1,000 big blinds or something insane, 1,100 big blinds effective, way more important to try and win a huge pot when you have such a strong hand than it is to try and protect those check calls. Anyway, so we do check raise this 4,500. This is actually probably a spot that I don't really love continuing for Terrace. I think he blocks a lot of draws. He wants to have me to have 9-7, Jack 7 suited. That's kind of unlikely, but 9-7 suited, 7-6 suited, 7-5 suited, and then spades and clubs hands. So I would just fold this, but Terrace does make the call, does have position. So looking to float and play some poker on later streets. The turn is a pretty confusing one. So the turn pairs the 10. Now top pair has become 3 of a kind. A few things I'm thinking about here as I go through my decision. So to start off with, my opponent has certainly improved to a good range of trips now. Certainly ace 10, king 10 can flatten the button, queen 10, jack 10. Pretty much all of the 10x hands pre can call. So I am concerned about 3 of a kind. And even still, considering that, when I have a hand like kings, I still do unblock all of the draws. So my opponent, if he can have jack 10 and queen 10, he can also have queen jack. That's certainly calling the flop. He can have jack 9. He can have 9-7 suited, 7-6 suited, maybe 7-5 suited, wants to float the gut shot, spade hands, backdoor club hands. There are a lot of hands you can imagine that might call this check raise, not to mention hands like 8x or even hands like pocket 7s. So I don't think we're at a point where we can start doing a ton of checking. And then also we can have some very good hands here. King 10, if you do check, is going to check raise some of the time. Ace 10, if you do check, is going to mainly check raise. I can also have hands like pocket 4s, pocket 8s. So 10-8 suited. So basically what I'm saying here is I think that even though it is scary that our opponent can be ahead of us now when they have a 10, we still need to be doing a lot of betting, because in this situation, we are still ahead of most of our opponent's range. But now card removal plays a much bigger role. And when card removal plays a big role, I tend to bet smaller. So in this situation, I like to go for a reasonably high frequency 1/3 pot bet, with our checks being a good portion of check folds, and then occasionally working in some check calls with maybe, for example, some of the higher over pairs that don't block the flush draw. So, aces and kings, no spade, probably be better check call candidates. Although kings does have some nice properties. When I have pocket kings, it's much more likely my opponent has one of those queen jack, queen nine, jack nine type of holdings. So this hand really couldn't go either way. Maybe it's not high frequency turn bet, maybe more like medium frequency turn bet. So we can bet with a chunk of our value bets. We can bet with some of our draws, particularly our good draws and our draws that unblock our opponent's floats, and then check fold with some hands like, let's just say, queen nine of diamonds, or let's just say like 7-6 of hearts. Those types of hands maybe want to just go for the check raise, check fold. So, when you do check, you are going to have a good amount of check folds, and we don't need to get too far down the check line here because we end up going for the bet, but it's totally okay when you check raise and check the turn or check the river to know that you are going to fold quite often. You just need to also sometimes put some traps in there. So in this spot specifically, hands like pocket 10s and 10-8 suited make very nice check raise checks. As you get this deep, you probably want to barrel them a little bit more often, but those hands make for some nice traps. And then you can also check raise, check call with some over pairs, and you can also check raise, check call with some strong draws. So that'll kind of round out your check call strategy. Anyway, we don't take the check line here. We do go for the bet. So we go for 1/3 pot, which I think is an important size to understand. When our opponent does have a lot of hands we're ahead of, but a class of their hands now becomes stronger than most of our value, we typically want to use smaller sizes to force them to defend wide. And then if they decide to represent that strong hand, we give ourselves kind of more room to navigate, and we don't narrow their range so specifically down to those hands. If I bet pot here on the turn, my opponent's just going to fold hands like sevens. And then when they do continue, it's going to be a lot scarier, and I'm going to be up against trips. Anyway, for Terrace here, kind of an interesting spot now. He does block a lot of the draws. That said, it is a very small bet, and he is drawing to boats. So I don't really mind any of Terrace's options here on the turn. Once again, I probably prefer fold, but I don't hate the other two options. And Terrace decides to bump it up and increase the size of this pot, making it $17,000 to go here on the turn. Okay, so we've talked a bit about my check line. Let's talk about my bets. So I am going to have some draws that bet turn. And when Terrace raises this big, it's a little over 4x of a raise. We're definitely going to want to have some folds. We're certainly going to want to be mixing in folds with all of the draws that aren't particularly strong draws are going to fold. But I think almost all of the value that bets the turn is probably going to want to continue. There are maybe a few specific value bets that don't love life. I'm thinking maybe something like black jacks, where you block spade and club bluffs, but you also don't block jack 10 suited. So there are some specific over pairs that you might want to consider folding, but typically speaking, when you're barreling after check raise and your opponent raises a small bet, general rule of thumb here, guys, you fold your draws unless they're very strong draws, and then you fold some of your thinnest value bets, but you mainly continue your value bets. If I'm going to bet kings here and fold to the raise, I'm going to fold way too much, and we only need to defend about half the time or so here. So in this situation with a hand this strong, we are going to purely call. And this is also one of the situations we talked about earlier where I am not going to have a 3-bet range here on the turn. A lot of times solvers will take bet 3-bet ranges here, but there's no way as a human I'm going to be able to play that well, and I don't want to put myself in situations where my range is capped and I'm this deep. So if I bet the turn and I get raised, I'm just going to call here. I can occasionally have those super strong hands like 10s or 10-8 suited, but those are mainly going to be checks. So I want to make sure that I still can have those hands in my range. And then we're going to evaluate the river based on the size that happens. Okay, so we think this over, and ultimately we do make the call. And we take a river hoping for a brick or a king. And we end up getting what we want. It is an offsuit 3, not a king, but just about as good as you can hope for. Once again, we check to Terrace. So Terrace takes his time to think this over for a little bit. I don't love bluffing here in Terrace's shoes because I'd rather at this point, the most important thing I'm thinking is I want to A, unblock draws, and B, I want to block 10x combos that call down. So if I'm Terrace, my favorite hands to call down here are probably favorite hands to bluff with are maybe a hand like Queen Jack, red Queen Jack. If I can have that, I block Queen 10, I block Jack 10. I don't think those are too likely to check raise the flop, but they're possible. I don't mind using a hand like a backdoor nut flush draw where maybe I have, for example, ace jack of clubs where I block ace 10, but I don't block the front door flush draw. I'd lean towards some bluffs like that. If I decided to bet the turn with maybe one of those straight draws that's lower, like 9-7, basically where I'm driving this is I want to either block the 3 of a kinds or I want to unblock the draws that can call fold. So I don't love using this hand. Has a club and a spade, and it doesn't block any irrelevant 10x. So I don't particularly love that. But for the sake of the video, luckily for us, Terrace doesn't mind all too often. And after a bit of a think here, he ends up betting $75,000. So back over to me with pocket kings facing a bet that large. What do we want to do? So I guess to start off with, we have to ask ourselves, do we have to call wider than a 10 here? Now, Jack 10 and Queen 10, we're not really check raising the flop that much. So we can have Jack 10 and Queen 10, yeah. So we can have King 10, we can have Ace 10, but we don't really have those all that often. Those are mainly going to be, the offsuit hands are probably getting folded here pre-flop under the gun +2. I would open an Ace 10, but probably not King 10. So we can have a good chunk of Ace 10s, but sets and Ace 10 is just not enough here to be able to defend our range. We're going to have to call a few overpairs. Now, we're going to have some draws that bricked. Those can fold. We're going to have queens, jacks, kings, and aces. We're a little more likely to have queens and jacks than kings and aces because kings and aces are in some of those trap lines that we mentioned earlier. So we're going to have jacks here a lot. We're going to have queens here a lot. We're going to have kings here a good amount. And we're going to have aces here some. Out of all of those, it's much better to have aces and kings. The reason is that you block him from having ace 10 and king 10, which are 2 of his likely value bets. And then you also don't block the draws. So aces and kings are better than queens and jacks here from just a cardinal perspective. Then on top of that, you would rather not have either flush draw, but you really especially probably don't want to have clubs because club hands typically make more sense to barrel than spade hands. I don't think it's that likely that hands like king, queen, or king, jack of spades are going to raise and barrel off. I think it's a little more likely to do with hands that unblock some of my bluffs. So the spade, I think it's relatively neutral. I would probably prefer to have 2 red kings than the spade, but I don't think it's that big of a deal either way. So the question is back to this. So he's risking $75,000 to win, 47 before the bet. Do I think I need to call kings? We've established that my draws fold. We established that, jacks are going to fold. We block too many straight draws. Queens are going to fold. We don't have aces that much. So I think we're right around having to call this part of the time. And a good rule of thumb here on trying to defend versus these large bets, in spots like this where you can have a good portion of trips and boats, you only have to defend outside of trips and boats just a little bit. And so if you have some of your best hands to call that are not those really strong hands, you can go ahead and do some randomization. Now, I know in live poker, a lot of people hate this. Oh, it's not real poker. Well, the way you play a strategy game correctly when things are really close is you do some of both. So in this situation, that's what I decided to do. Weighing all of these factors, I think it's very close. And I'll go ahead and let you listen in. All right, Terrace. We're going to play one of my favorite games.
He's going to flip it again.
We're going to play I Flip a Coin. So here's how it's going to work.
I thought you were talking about the knit game.
I'm binding. I'm going to flip a coin. I have 2 kings. I have a king of spades and king of hearts. If you pick the king of spades, I call. If you pick the king of hearts, I fold.
Love
Should I
this.
flip over my hand?
Yeah, I'm binded. I'm locked in.
Okay.
This is good fucking TV.
He's a sicko.
What card does he want?
That was a thin value bet.
So
it was not a value bet. It was not a value bet. Okay.
all right.
So basically
Confirm
a
this is a king of hearts and king of spades.
Confirmed.
Okay, so king of hearts, king of spades. So king of spades is bad for you. I win. I'm gonna call
So I don't want the king of spades.
You want to pick up the king
that. You
of
want the king of hearts.
Okay. King of hearts. Shuffle it.
Hearts!
I mean, you're getting late odds on it.
Can we get
Safi.
Hearts! Yeah, you could just cinematic call.
there's actually I want
Say this
what's your
all
name?
time,
Sorry.
and
It's good for you.
You cover me. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's gonna let Safi choose the fate.
All right.
Our beautiful game host, Safi, coming to the table.
Can you pick?
I don't know.
All right. I win king of spades. He wins.
Remember, your boss only loses a
king of spades is
220K
allowed
pot.
for me.
A 200K pot.
No, I can't lose 200K pot because
Okay, I need the king of hearts. Can you pick a
king
king
of
of hearts
spades.
for me?
King of
please?
spades.
I want a king of hearts.
The other one.
King of spades.
Poor Safi.
Okay, go. I want the hearts. I want the king of hearts. Come on.
Let's go.
Doug wins every flip.
He really does.
It's unbelievable.
Nice one. Nice one.
Thank you.
He folded, right? He threw his cards in front of the
No,
line.
you didn't fold it.
No. This month's lesson, where I break down 20 hands that I played in that type of format, is now available in the Upswing Lab. And we have a discount running. Use Doug50 for $50 off your purchase of the Upswing Lab. I know a lot of people like to learn from me, even though my technical expertise may be a little bit behind some of the rest of the guys in the lab. I'm sure you guys are familiar with my style of teaching. If you'd like to hop into the lab and learn, I'll put a link in the description below. Thank you guys for tuning in. And this is going to end on Monday, I believe. It's a sale, guys. See you Monday.